This is the first of two short videos explaining the process of writing a summary. In addition to what you see in here, you should take a look at the discussion in Chapter 2. You should also use the summary articles that are embedded inside Pearson Writer. The way you get to that is by opening Pearson Writer, typing the word summary into the search box, and seeing where it takes you. There's also a couple of handouts on Blackboard. Why do we summarize? Well, it's part, as I said in the first video, of reading as a believer, reading as a doubter. It's a way of understanding other people's ideas and making them your own. It's also a way of giving and taking credit for the ideas that you get and the content that you find, and taking credit for your own ideas and your own research. The fourth thing to think about is that it's another way of including and accounting for the data that's inside a paper. And finally, it helps you establish one voice that is your voice. People don't want to hear 6 or 7 different voices in a paper. They want to hear one, and they want that voice to be the name of the author of the paper. There are 3 basic tools in summary. The first is direct quotation, where you put the source's own words in, you put them in quotation marks, and they appear in your paper exactly as in the original. This is the least used form of summary. The second is summary, where it's all in your own words except for those words that don't really have any replacement or numbers. For instance, you wouldn't summarize a number, and it's normally shorter than the original. And a paraphrase is all your own words, with a few exceptions like the ones that I noted in the summary comment, and about the same length of the original. The way you think about this is we summarize articles, we paraphrase sentences, and we quote interesting pieces of language. We'll explain that further. When do we use these? You summarize an entire source, you summarize an article, you summarize a video, you summarize an op-ed piece, a letter to the editor. You paraphrase sentences that come from that source when you want to call attention to a writer's thinking or examples. And we quote least, seldom more than a sentence, and normally you do it just to give a flavor or some colorful piece of language from the writer who you're including. And again, people want to read your words, they don't want to read the source. And, oh, by the way, never quote a fact. We summarize articles, we paraphrase sentences, and we quote words and phrases. That's one of the ways to think about this. How long is a summary? It has to be long enough to be useful to you. Sometimes a summary is just one sentence from an article, and then maybe it's 1 or 2 sentences that are paraphrases of example sentences from the writer's work. But it varies. The length should be as long as you need it to be to help you make the point in your paper. For this course, the first assignment is a summary, and I'm asking you to write 350 to 500 words. And that's basically to force you into editing your content down to the minimum needed to make sense of it. When you do the annotated bibliography, your summaries may work out to about 250 or more words for an article. So it's going to vary. The numbers that I've assigned here are a little arbitrary, in fact, but you're going to learn eventually as the course goes on how to include sources in a way where you summarize material and include it to help you make the case that you want to make. A rule of thumb that you run into in every single English teacher book I've ever read says it shouldn't be any more than 25% as long as the original, but that's not really very helpful advice. I include that only to point out that it's very common advice, but it's not very helpful. What do you include in a summary? Well, here's a variety of factors. The first thing you write is a 1-sentence summary, and that says, here's the Fred Smith article on academic integrity, makes the claim that blah, blah, blah. And that's going to be your first sentence. After that, you're going to have a variety of choices to make. You might want to include useful, what we call hard data, names, dates, and statistics, for example. You may include quotation after that first sentence. You may have a particular phrase that the writer uses that you might find striking or colorful. But again, you do not quote facts. Never quote a fact. I'm going to say that over and over again because it's a very easy habit to fall into. It's hard to break, but don't do it. It's going to make you sound not as mature and as smart as you really are. You try to retain the emphasis of the original in the sense that if the author devotes 2 pages to a particular topic in a 6-page article, then maybe about 1/3 of your summary should be on that particular topic within that summary. You also try to include the conclusions and recommendations if the authors have included any. And that should probably come towards the end of your summary, just like it usually does in the original. Um, when you tend to include information, whether you summarize or paraphrase or quote, we use what are called attributive tags, or some texts call them author tags, and some call them signal phrases, author, last name, and credentials. And I'll show you examples of that. The first time you use an author, you use their full name, Robert Smith, and then subsequent references to them, you just use their last name, Smith. You never refer to an author by his or her first name only. Okay, we're not in third grade anymore. Keep your opinion in a separate paragraph. Sometimes you can use first person to do that. Sometimes you can use a verb. And we'll talk about this when we talk about integrating sources and writing paragraphs later in the course. For the summary assignment, don't worry about your own opinion. Okay, you're just trying to get down the content of the article. There's a sample summary in our textbook on pages 28 through 29, and I'll be referring to that as we go through this video and the next. Okay. How do you write a one-sentence summary? The first thing you do is read the source multiple times, that believing and doubting business that we learned about in the previous video. And then write out author's full name and credentials, psychiatrist Fred Smith, uh, you know, President Donald Trump, if you're going to include a source from him. And then you write out the topic, and then what their claim or their thesis is, what their research results are, and their conclusions. And you may put that all into one sentence. You may make it two, but it should include enough so the audience that you're writing this for understands who the person is who's writing this and what they're writing about. Normally we leave out the article title because we can go to the reference page or the works cited page and see that. The only time you put an article title into a one-sentence summary is if there's no author identified. Why do we do this? Again, it becomes the first sentence of the summary, and it contextualizes what follows. The audience understands who the source is, what their overall point is, and then they can begin to decide how they're going to evaluate that in the context of your summary. Here's an example of one. This comes from our textbook. In his New Yorker article, "The Pay is Too Damn Low," James Surowiecki argues that raising the minimum wage is only a partial solution to the problem of poverty and needs to be supplemented with a European-style social security network, including an earned income tax credit, universal health insurance, affordable childcare, and investment of almost $1 trillion in infrastructure to create good middle-class jobs. So we have the publication up here at the top where it says New Yorker. We have the author's name, and so the assumption here is that he's a writer for the New Yorker, so that's his credential. Here's his verb, argues, and here are the things that he argues for and about. Okay, and we have kind of the laundry list of things that he wants us to include in his article, that he mentions in his article as ways of getting to what he wants. Again, you'll find exactly the same one on page 29 in our textbook. What about paraphrasing? So that's writing a one-sentence summary. What comes next? Well, what should come next is a series of sentences where you're taking information from the source and you're putting it into your own words. People own the words they say and write, so you're indicating what is your information, what comes from your sources, and what are your own ideas. And we do this through the process of paraphrasing. How does this work? Most of your summary is going to be paraphrased sentences or data or examples, pretty much like you saw in that one sentence summary, other kinds of support that you'll see in the paper. If you do use exact words within a sentence, then they should be in quotation marks. There are some exceptions to that, of course, proper names, extremely common words, and words with no generally accepted synonym. And we'll get into some examples of this later on. Okay. How do we document this? You document words and ideas that are not your own. We use in MLA and APA what's called in-text citation system. Our textbook uses MLA almost exclusively. It discusses it in Appendix 2. I've also got some handouts in Blackboard and some information from Pearson Writer, obviously, on in-text citation use. We'll also be talking, as we get into documentation, about APA citations, which are very similar but rely, they have a little bit different formatting, but they use the same in-text system. And we'll get into that later on. For our purposes, for your summary, if you just say, the author says, the writers point out, and you use their names, that's going to be sufficient citation. Again, the point of this is to give credit or take credit. depending on what the sentence is about, and it avoids plagiarism. And you need to document summary, paraphrase, and quotation. Many students have told me they think that paraphrase doesn't need to be documented, and of course it does, but it's real easy to do that, and I'll show you some simple ways to do that when we get into documentation. Thank you very much, and we'll go on to part 2 here in a minute.